Hey, do you like the Eldar? Well, congratulations. Evidently, you don't work at GW.
I'll canvass all the seediest lowbrow dives in town to find my minions. And I know just how to speak their language. Felicitations, malefactors! I am endeavoring to misappropriate the formulary for the preparation of affordable comestibles! Who will join me? I don't get it.
Hi, I'm Chrono the Harlequin, and welcome back to Live from the Black Library, where today I want to talk to you about what faction in Warhammer 40,000 likes the Eldar the most. Now, before we begin, I would just like to say, you're probably wondering why I sound like this, and that's because not only do I have the flu, I have a chest infection. Very likely pneumonia or bronchitis, and I guess we're gonna have to just live with this because these can take 10 to 11 days to clear up. But if you'd like to help me forge on, I would really appreciate it if you guys would like this video, subscribe, and support me on Patreon if you can, so that I can make these videos faster, and consider joining my Discord server too to keep up with me and all the projects I'm working on. But without further ado, let's get into what faction likes the Eldari the most. Now, this video was initially going to be what subgroup of the Imperium likes the Eldar the most, but I thought I might as well expand it to include the Xenos races as well. And another thing to quickly specify, when I say Eldari, I'm actually just referring to the Asuryani, because the Harlequins are too rare to even have people form an opinion of them, the Exodites are far too insular, and nobody likes the Drukhari at all. One time the Tau made an honest try of it, but we're still talking about how badly that went all this time later. And speaking of the Tau, let's start with them, because the only mainline interaction that we know of that we've seen between the Asuryani and the Tau came after some pretty rough misunderstanding. You see, the Drukhari would deceive the Tau into thinking they would be allies against the Tyranids and might be interested in joining the greater good. This is called the War of Dark Revelations, where they would give several Tau over to the Drukhari as a sort of quote-unquote cultural exchange. And as you can imagine, the Tau were pretty surprised and not very happy when their friends turned up as grotesques on the battlefield, and when the Drukhari backstabbed them and started raiding Tau worlds that were undefended. Given that this was their first interaction with the Eldari race altogether, and they had no reason to believe the species was split down various lines, they immediately attacked an Eldari maiden world, thinking that they were all the same and that the entire species could not be reasoned with, similar to the Orks. But Craftworld Eandon would step into the defense of the maiden world, and a battle would persist over the course of weeks, given the Eldari's capabilities and the Tau's tenacity, but they would eventually come to realize they had both been duped. And even though the Tau would reach out the hand of friendship towards Eandon, they would basically snub them, but relations between the two have not been that frosty. Again, interactions are very limited because Tau space is very small, and craft worlds are very often on the move. However, when they do get together, it usually is very well coordinated, because even though the Eldari are not coming into the greater good anytime soon, they can at least cooperate and aren't willing to tear each other to shreds. Interestingly though, there is actually a quote by none other than Eldrad Ulthran about the Tau, where he says, "I have followed the myriad potential futures of the Tau with great interest. Though barely even striplings compared to us, I feel a strange protectiveness towards them. In time, I believe they will exceed even our greatest feats and master the darkness within their souls." But it should be noted that is from the Tau 3rd edition Codex, which was their first codex. So that was them being literally introduced to the setting. So I guess you could really question how much it still applies. But that being said, I think it is fair to say that the Tau have some of the best relations with the Eldari out of any other group in the entire setting, and I think that's really interesting. They can get on just fine, although, knowing the Eldar, those relations are still frosty at best, especially considering the fact that the Tau don't really know much of anything about chaos as of yet. They're starting to learn, but ever since they've begun to really get an idea of what they're up against, we haven't really seen them have any interactions with the Eldari thus far. Next up, I'm just gonna knock a bunch of these out of the park at once. Genestealers, Orks, Tyranids, none of them like the Eldari at all, and the Eldari do not like them at all. In fact, the Eldari are actively terrified of a lot of them and look down their nose at them rightly. Interestingly though, The Tyranids don't seem to target Eldari as much as you think they would, given how psychically active the Eldari are. Probably because, again, they have no access to Gamora, and the Eldari Maiden Worlds are few and far between, though we do have some examples of them being overrun by the Tyranids, and the Craft Worlds are mobile, making them not the easiest targets in the world. Plus, they're not that heavy on life, and the Eldar are good at defending themselves, so attacking a craft world as a high fleet is not really an amazing investment resource-wise, and that is how the Tyranids measure things. The Leagues of Votan 2 we only have sparse information about, because apparently they have decent trading relations with the Eldari and can get along well enough, but again, we just don't have much because we don't have much about the Votan as of yet. The interesting one, though, before we start getting into the Imperium is the Necrons, because yes, they and the Eldari do not get along at all. They do not like the Eldar and the Eldar don't like them. But they have a begrudging respect for the Eldari, and the Eldar seem to have at least an acknowledgement of the power and threat that the Necrons pose, and are determined to stop them from waking up. In fact, they will attack Adeptus Mechanicus outposts that could possibly awake a Necron tomb world. But despite that, the Necrons do seem to have a kind of fondness for the Eldari, almost like a form of nostalgia, saying, "Oh, there goes our old ancient enemy, I wonder what they're up to, and, you know, for a race that's literally dying, they're doing a pretty decent job of hanging on. I guess they don't make them like they used to, huh?" Like, there is an acknowledgement of their capabilities as their ancient enemy, and at least sort of a nod of respect, even though the Necrons do, and in my opinion rightly, view themselves leaps and bounds ahead of the Eldari. And glossing over chaos because, obviously, let's get to the Imperium of Man, and this is one that needs to be broken up into many parts. Interestingly, given how wildly things vary in the Imperium, and just how decentralized a lot of its institutions are, these answers can vary wildly depending on who's being spoken about. But I'm gonna try and go for the base vibe. Now, starting with the Imperial Guard, they tend to not get along well with the Eldari, usually because whenever they come to blows, they're already on the surface of a planet and are already gearing up for war anyway, because the Eldari are not going to go down to a planet in force unless they have a very good reason to do so. And if the humans are there, they likely view that as some kind of intrusion, because the Eldari are either trying to destroy something, trying to prevent something they have seen in the future, or are trying to protect something. And humans have a habit of just kind of bowling over whatever and not listening to the Eldar's advice when they provide it. But to be fair, you can't really blame them too much given the massive amount of enmity there is. So generally speaking, whenever the Imperial Guard and the Eldari are near each other or interacting, it's usually gonna be negative, except in rare instances of cooperation, such as when the Talarn Desert Raiders cooperated with the forces of Bael'tan to repel an Iron Warrior's invasion, where the two would acknowledge each other's capabilities and sign a pact of friendship. And there was an instance where Samhain aided the Imperial Guard, but only after the Imperium handed over a few people who had wronged them before. But what about the Space Marines? Well, the Astartes tend to not be fans of the Eldari, well, shocking, but even more so than the Imperial Guard, because when normal humans don't like Xenos, that's just because of dogma and obligation. Deep down, it's not really a huge thing for them, but with Space Marines, their hatred of Xenos is literally genetically encoded in them, so they tend to get along with the Eldari even less. But they do tend to interact with them a fair bit more. And that's usually because when the Space Marines are involved in a campaign, it's usually quite important, and as such the Eldari will sometimes intervene, both against them and on their side, oftentimes against the common enemy of Tyranids or Chaos. However, that used to be more prevalent in the earlier lore, and is something that has kind of fallen off as time has gone on, with the two groups becoming more and more isolated and the Eldari appearing less and less in the lore, with one exception, the Ultramarines. You see, the Ultramarines had their Primarch Rabute Guilliman revived from stasis by an Eldari, that being Yvraine, leader of the Ynnari, and as such, they used to have some Craftworld Ulthwé correspondents along with them to serve as attachés between the Imperium and Ultramarines and the Eldari, but more specifically Craftworld Ulthwé, which does have a level of clout among the craft worlds. So, that was something. However, the Ynnari plotline has been canonically shelved in recent editions, and we've generally heard neither hide nor hair of this cooperation ever since. So it really does seem like there's nothing to be gained for the Eldari by working with the Space Marines anymore, ever since GW decided on that sea change of theirs. And if the zeal of the Space Marines seems bad for the Eldari, you can imagine all the forces of the Adeptus Ministorum are much, much worse. I don't think the Eldari would ever get along with the Sisters of Battle, even though we've never really seen them do so, aside from the one singular exception of Ephriel Stern, a Sister of Battle who's effectively been running around with a former Harlequin named Kaiganil, who's just been basically going on some wacky adventures fighting chaos here and there. She's kind of a holdover from like the 1990s when Warhammer was a much weirder setting with a lot more interesting things going on in my opinion, and more out there wild characters, as opposed to the very stern and militaristic setting that it's becoming now with characters that are more quote-unquote grounded, but I digress. So, what about the Adeptus Mechanicus? Well, for them, it's honestly kind of weird because they don't seem to like or dislike the Eldari very much, just viewing them as outside of the purview of the machine god, because their technology is so wildly different, and they have nothing to gain by studying Eldari technology, given that, of course, it's all made out of Wraithbow. However, the Eldari tend to really not like the Adeptus Mechanicus, viewing them as the height of human ignorance, and often attacking them even more readily than other Imperials, because oftentimes they will be digging around into something they shouldn't be, such as ancient Eldari ruins, or more often, Necron tomb worlds that the Eldar would rather remain dormant. I could go on in the nitty-gritty of all the different institutions of the Imperium, but I think you get the gist of it now. The Eldari are generally speaking not well liked by the Imperium, and when they come into contact it's usually for no good reason. There are, however, 4 big exceptions to this, and the first one is rogue traders. You see, rogue traders are very rare individuals in Warhammer in that they have a lot of freedom. You see, they are people whose families have been given something called the Warrant of Trade by the Emperor himself. And with this warrant of trade, they can go beyond the bounds of the Imperium and act almost entirely independently, but they do still have some rules they need to follow and can be punished if they break them. They are some of the only humans who are allowed to make deals with Xenos and interact with them freely without it being considered heresy. This allows the Imperium to gain access to information from Xenos and about them, and trade with them and get some of their technology without sullying the soul of the greater Imperium itself. And relations between rogue traders and Eldari tend to be pretty damn good, because since most Xenos species are quite dangerous, it makes sense that dealing with the Eldari is pretty easy, well at least the Asuryani, because they're a lot more reasonable, and the Asuryani for their part don't really view individual rogue traders as a threat, because they know that those people are just motivated by profit and personal advancement, and don't personally have the resources to really pose a threat to a craft world or a large group of Eldari. And since the rogue traders know this themselves, they're not gonna risk all that they have and their freedom by trying to antagonize them for very little gain. Interestingly though, it's not uncommon for rogue traders to have an Eldari in their crew. Well, it's certainly not common either, but it's absolutely not unheard of. That's because these people will often be Eldari outcasts, usually people who have become rangers all on their own, or otherwise are seeking adventure, or need to repay some kind of debt. And since most rogue traders are both allowed to recruit Xenos, and are willing to recruit these outcasts so that they can gain access to the very potent skills of an Eldari, it's a really good way for them to go on adventures, do some good in the galaxy, and most importantly, scope out potential threats to their mother craft world. It should be noted though, Eldari Corsairs, that being those outcasts who have chosen a life of piracy while not being Drukhari, are a bit of a problem for rogue traders, and they will often come to blows. But there is generally speaking an understanding that what the Eldari Corsairs do isn't signed off on by their mother craft world. So, interestingly, the rogue traders have very good relations with Eldar, but they're not a huge institution. they're more so individual actors. And this also holds true, albeit a bit differently, for the Inquisition. You see, many Inquisitors are fond of the Eldari. Well, fond is probably not the right word to use here. They're tolerant of the Eldari, because they view them as a common ally in the fight against chaos. You see, the Inquisition is divided into 3 branches: the Ordo Xenos, the Ordo Malleus, and the Ordo Hereticus. The Ordo Hereticus deals with fighting heretics, and, as you know, heretics consist of anybody who also consorts with Xenos. So, they're not that fond of the Eldari, but many heretics will often have ties to the demonic, and as such there isn't a vested interest in at least tolerating some Eldari input from time to time. And of course it does bear mentioning that the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Hereticus are the Sisters of Battle, who we've spoken of already. However, things really get interesting when you look into the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Malleus. You see, as the name implies, the Ordo Xenos are meant to investigate plots and dangers of Xenos' origin to the Imperium, and this of course includes the Eldari. However, the Asuryani are again not the biggest threat to the Imperium, and do try to stay out of their way, even though they can be a problem from time to time. And in terms of named individual characters, most of the time when Inquisitors have dealings with the Eldari, they are of the Ordo Xenos, because they view them as valuable sources of information in regard to dealing with common threats, such as Inquisitor Draxus having dealings with an Eldari Harlequin, who gave her information about the Necrons. And of course there is the Inquisitor Gideon Ravener, a wildly important character in Dan Abnett's Inquisitor series, who has very good relations with Eldari Farseers, who he has collaborated with and tried to keep the peace with, having said to them, "We must avoid war between the empires," referring to the Eldari Empire as, quote, "the old empire." He really tries to keep the peace, even though there is no small amount of friction. And that's really the main total of the relationship between the Ordo Xenos and the Eldari: mediation and oftentimes information sharing, which is really interesting and very important, even though it isn't all that much. But it should be noted, there certainly are Ordo Xenos Inquisitors who are like, "Kill, kill, kill, the Eldari must be exterminated, we cannot trust them, they're perfidious, blah blah blah." Which, to be fair, is not a completely unreasonable position to have, given that they are keenly aware that the Eldari know far more than them, and always will, and as such can never be fully trusted because you don't know when they're playing you. And there have been some intense conflicts between the Eldari and the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Xenos, that being the Death Watch, elite space marines who are selected specifically for their great abilities in regard to killing and dispatching dangerous Xenos threats. Now, the thing about them is, they used to be a lot more important in the lore back in the day, but have since fallen off. And in one very reviled incident, they scuppered an attempt by the Eldari led by Eldrad Ulthran to basically summon Ynead, the fancy new Eldari god of the dead, and kill Slaanesh, which could have likely saved the galaxy, but would have also turned off the Astronomicon for some time and cost billions of human lives. But still, a lot of people really hated that plot point, and as such, the Death Watch have had a horrible reputation ever since then. Interestingly though, for the Ordo Malleus, it's kind of the opposite, because while Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus don't seem to interact with the Eldari very much, even though they both have a common enemy in fighting demons, their Chamber Militant, the Grey Knights, have historically had very good relations with the Eldari. So good, in fact, that they have worked together and fought side by side multiple times, and have a mutual respect for each other. In fact, one of the oldest videos on my channel is about the relationship between the Grey Knights and the Eldari, and just how uniquely positive it is. So much so that I described it as a quote-unquote bromance. This is because they have entered onto dead craft worlds to fight demons, and then respected the authority of the Eldar when they came to ask questions about it, even handing over several soul stones to them, something the Eldari were very grateful for. And there is actually an old piece of lore where the Grey Knights hitched a ride with some Eldari Harlequins and fought alongside them when attacking some Chaos Space Marine pirates. This actually isn't something we see so much in the current lore, because the only major interaction we see between the Grey Knights and the Eldari is friction between a leader of the Grey Knights and an Eldari attaché to Rabute Guilliman named Ilya Natase, where they basically just argue over the fact that the Eldari find humanity annoying. It's a very brief interaction, and aside from just being a little bit funny, it more or less slides under the radar. And it's kinda sad because both the Eldari and the Grey Knights have absolutely been backbenched in the current setting. Part of this is because, one, the Eldar just have been essentially written out, and that really sucks, and the Grey Knights have become all but useless, given the fact that everybody knows about demons now, and all Space Marine chapters are required to fight them at some point or another, more or less, making their specialty honestly moot. So that covers the biggest allies the Eldari have on the side of the Imperium. First, the rogue traders, but they're again a very small group of individuals. Next being the Ordo Xenos Inquisitors, but again, that is a case-by-case basis because some can be very anti-Eldari, and the Grey Knights, who are a very small institution, which doesn't really seem to get wheeled out all that often, and given their rarity, don't come into contact with the Eldari all that often. But there's one I haven't mentioned, and it is the single greatest friend the Asuryani have in the entire Imperium of Man, and that is the Imperial Navy, otherwise known as the Navis Imperialis. You see, the Imperial Navy is, generally speaking, the best equipped to deal with the Eldari because they're not meeting them on the surface of a planet, and as such, they're more likely to come into contact with the Asuryani on quote-unquote neutral ground, or at least when there isn't already some active factor in play that is causing the Eldari to act. Like I said, if you meet them on a planet, they're down there for a reason, and if you could possibly be in the way of whatever reason there is, they're likely not going to listen to you because they view you as below them. But the Imperial Navy will come into contact with Eldari craft worlds fairly often, because those craft worlds will often drift into Imperial space. And there is actually a protocol for dealing with this. You would expect the Imperial Navy to just panic and open fire on a giant continent-sized Xeno vessel in their territory, but they actually know better than that. Because, yes, a battle fleet could destroy a craft world, but it will likely cost the entire battle fleet. And as such, it's generally seen as not worth it, especially considering they know those craft worlds aren't an invasion force. And conversely, the Eldari won't antagonize Imperial Navy vessels that happen to be nearby because they know that it's not some band of pirates or chaos fleet coming to attack them. So, they will hold their fire. And yes, while they probably could destroy whatever Imperial vessels are nearby, it's not worth it to bring that kind of heat onto the craft world itself. So, the Imperial Navy will, generally speaking, give Eldari craft worlds and their defensive fleets a wide breadth, and the Eldari, for their part, will be on their best behavior so as not to antagonize a very dangerous problem. But this relationship between the two isn't just surmised as, I won't mess with you if you won't mess with me, let's not do anything stupid, but is actually, in my estimation, one of the most beneficial fighting alliances in the galaxy, because they have a very dangerous common enemy, that being Chaos Fleets and Ork Waaghs. You see, the Eldari don't really care when an Ork Waagh hits a planet unless it's a maiden world, unless of course they've foreseen some long string of future consequences through their Farseers, and Chaos Fleets on planets are usually the Imperium's problem for the same reason, even though that is less desirable. However, the Eldari in space can't really run. So if there is a Chaos Fleet or an Ork Waagh, or the Tyranids for that matter, coming towards a craft world, they need to step up and defend it in space as best they can. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Eldari fighting fleets are some of the most proactive forces in the entire race, because they have to defend their craft worlds that are not very fast. Those things move at sub-light speeds, and as such, any threat to them must be dealt with immediately with all ferocity. And since the Imperium is no threat to them, they will work with the Imperial Navy very regularly, especially since whatever is gunning for that craft world is probably headed for Imperial space next. So, the Imperium has an vested interest in working alongside Eldari fleets to repel whatever is there and whatever is causing problems. And the biggest example of this is the entire 12th Black Crusade, known as the Gothic War, when Abaddon and his massive Chaos fleet, led by a ship known as the Planet Killer, would proceed to ravage their way across the Imperium's Gothic sector until they were finally stopped by Battlefleet Gothic and the forces of Craftworld on Lolsus. You see, these two saw the threat that the Chaos fleet led by Abaddon posed to both of them, and as such, after some hiccups and deception by the Dark Eldar, managed to put aside their differences and work together. You see, the Dark Eldar actually tricked the two into fighting each other, but it wasn't long until they realized what had happened. Kind of like the War of Dark Revelations, before it was cool. To this effect, the fast ships of the Eldari would locate Abaddon's fleet and send word back to the Imperial Navy, who would then be permitted to use the Eldari's webway gates to reach the front in record time, catching Abaddon off guard. But even then, it would still take a few hard-fought battles, wherein the Imperial Navy would engage Abaddon's fleet, and then the Eldari forces would come out of nowhere to assist them, oftentimes to spectacular results, given the fact that the two can cover each other's differences, with the Imperial Navy being sturdy but slow, and the Eldari crafts being very well armed, more fragile, but a lot faster. So these two, working side by side, managed to stop an entire Black Crusade. And it also created a legacy of understanding between Battlefleet Gothic and the Eldari, with the Eldari even greeting the flagship Mechanicus with the phrase, "Good hunting," when they first hailed them to take on the forces of the Despoiler together, their traditional greeting. This first happened at the Battle of Gethsemane, which was a resounding victory, albeit a hard-fought one, and would continue all the way until the end of the Gothic War. In fact, this cooperation between the two signaled the turning point where humanity finally started to win the 12th Black Crusade. So the cooperation between the Imperial Navy and the Eldari isn't just small flash-in-the-pan moments like it is with the Grey Knights or the Inquisition, but can actually go as far as to sustained joint campaigns against common enemies to rid their threat from a certain sector of space. That's huge, and something you literally just do not see in 40k at all. Furthermore, both of them have an invested interest in opposing the Drukhari, and have been on the receiving end of Drukhari deception before. And even though Eldari Corsairs are a pain in the ass for the Imperial Navy, they're still generally speaking more of a nuisance, not really taking planets or wiping out entire fleets, but mostly just ambushing trade convoys and caravans of supplies. Again, still not great, but not the worst thing in the world, it's just them being annoying. And it's generally understood that whatever craft world those Eldari Corsairs do hail from originally are not being signed off on by them, and as such it can't really be held against them fully. And an interesting theory that I have is that part of the reason it's easier for Eldari and humans to work together in the context of ships and void battles is simply because they don't have to see each other face to face as much, because that's where the differences start to come up. That's where the ingrained xenophobia on both sides really starts to flare, when you're looking at someone in the face, and you have to see every little bit of them, and every mannerism, and hear every condescension. However, when there is that kind of distance, and you're talking over the Voxnet, it makes it significantly easier to effectively just plug your nose and close your eyes and get on with it. You can actually kinda see something like this in the short story Wraithflight, where a spirit seer from Craftworld Eandon comes to the aid of a human fleet defending a world against a Tyranid onslaught, and speaks to the guy over the Vox. "I am Iana Arianel, spirit seer of Eandon," she says. Human speech was so limited, incapable of conveying subtlety other than at great length. She was thankful for that. They would take what she said at face value. "We come to offer aid." There was a delay, messages restricted to the speed of light. A psychic impression came along before their reply. The sense of relief was palpable. These were creatures who would burn her alive simply for being what she was. How things were different when they were alone and afraid. The minds of Monkai were as blunt as pebbles. Presently, a human male appeared in a vision bubble. The machines of Yniad's herald perfectly reproduced his ugliness. His face and voice betrayed his suspicion. "I am Captain Hortense of the Glorious Conquest. We should consider coordinating our efforts. What are your intentions?" Iana opened her eyes and allowed her image to appear to him. "We kill their mine ships, then their mother." Another pause. "The great vessel at the heart of the fleet?" Iana inclined her head slightly. To an Eldar, this would have indicated an affirmative, although one layered with sarcastic approval to the other, so obviously stating the correct opinion. Then, she remembered with whom she was speaking. "Yes," she said. "We are close. Your disruption of their flank will allow us to penetrate deep into the swarm. We will press forward and destroy them. We fight together?" Ileana winced at the rough barking of the human's speech. Spit flew when he spoke. Eldar children had more control of themselves. "Yes, together." She said it slowly, lest the human not understand. Hold them from turning back until we have disrupted their psychic network. Then, you must press forward without delay." He stared at her dumbly while her message winged itself on airless waveforms to his craft. Then he nodded, invigorated. She was help unlooked for. Relief ran with the sweat from his face. "Perhaps we might— I have spoken." She cut their chatter with a thought. The humans were tiring to listen to. Now that does sound great, but it should be noted, it's not all chuckles and sunshine between the Imperial Navy and the Eldari. After this, they do fight on the same side for some time, but there is more to the Eldar's intentions. Simply put, they wanted to destroy the planet that the humans were defending because they foresaw that it was going to be consumed, and as such, would fuel the Tyranid momentum forward. So, they effectively call in an Exterminatus-level weapon, by Eldari standards, to destroy the planet. So, when they see that the humans have penetrated the heart of the swarm and are attacking the Norn ship at the center, they start to withdraw. "The humans signal us again," said Ythelmaniri. Iana shrugged. "Allow them to speak," the shrug said, "but I do not care what they will say." Captain Hortense's face appeared again. It was clouded. His lumpen human features exhibited dismay, or some simple human feeling akin to it. "What are you doing?" "We have accomplished our task," said Iana. "The skein has shifted in our favor. The future conforms to our design." The pressure of the hive mind, already broken by their extermination of the hive ships, diminished further as Yanit's herald sped back towards the webway gate. "You are leaving us to die. You are leaving our world to be consumed." "Not so," Iana said. "Look." Upon the grey marble of Krokengard, a flame was lit. Hortense was distracted for a moment, his crew delivering information. Iana knew what it must be. Hortense's face hardened. It was all a ruse. You came to attack us." His mouth twisted. "Exterminatus, you have destroyed our world. Perfidious are the Eldar. Trust them not." He quoted some human religious text. "I should have known no kindness would come from you." Iana could have cut the feed, but she did not. Some feeling crept into her for this lesser creature. He had fought bravely. "A fireheart," she explained. "A device to destroy this world so that the great dragon may not feast upon it. We kill you, yes, but it is better we do than the great dragon draw sustenance from your world." She paused. "You have my apologies." She surveyed the battle. The High Fleet remnants fought on, disunited but deadly still. "To attack these creatures and aid you further would result in unacceptable losses to my people," she said. "There are times coming when we will fight by your side. Today is not one of those occasions. The ship of their swarm queen is dying. This world is dead. There is nothing for them to feed on but their own dead, and nothing to reconstitute them if consumed. This tendril is destroyed, and the way through here will offer no sustenance should the great dragon choose to force it in the future. Surely this is worth your sacrifice. One world from any?" She blinked, examined the human cautiously. She pitied him. His own kind did the same elsewhere, and yet he was still appalled. How many others had he thoughtlessly condemned himself? One's own extinction always seemed to matter more. "If you withdraw now, you might save some of your ships," she continued. "You have, after all, nothing left to defend here." Hortense spluttered. She hoped he would heed her. "This is an out!" Her psychic impulse ended their conversation. "Take us home, Captain Ythelmaniri," and that's it. She sets off to leave, knowing she's saved 15 planets at the cost of 1, and having effectively worked alongside the Imperial Navy, although kinda backstabbing them. However, I think we can all agree that we kinda get it. Like, yeah, she's pulling a Cryptman here, but still, I guess it does make sense. And honestly, all things considered, knowing the Eldari, they've done some much worse stuff and humiliated humans way worse that they had just been helping before. Like, at the very least, at least she felt bad. Furthermore though, something else happens, and it's a very famous scene. Even if you don't know the short story Wraithflight, you know this scene. It's the scene where the hive mind links up with her psychically and expresses the fact that it personally hates her. This is where we get the distinction that the hive mind isn't just some autonomic feature, it's not just instinct. It is a living, malicious entity. It is actively evil. And then she and her entire crew basically have an aneurysm and pass out screaming, with some of them straight up dying. After that, though, it does go back to her relationship with the Navy. She awoke later. Yanit's herald was dark. She exhaled brokenly, her legs were weak. She hauled herself to her feet by grabbing a couch's cocoon. Her fingers had no strength to them. The other spirit seers lay limp in their cots. 2, she was sure, were dead. The steersman was slumped over the control jewels, and the captain was a crumpled peacock on the floor. The main viewing bubble glowed still. Through it, she saw the Eldar fleet was in disarray, drifting powerless. The humans fought on, however. The Norn ship burned fiercely. Was this what had severed the connection between her and the Great Dragon? Thinking of the contact made her nauseous. As her mind reached out to the ship, the dead of Ynid's herald woke too, creeping from their hiding places in the Infinity Core, shocked and timorous. The lights came back on, a dull glow from the walls that grew until the ship looked as it should. Ythelem groaned and rolled over. He stood shakily, struggling with his iridescent cape to free his arms. The steersman and other crew came to groggily. "My lady?" "I am well, Ythelem," she said. Her eyes were fixed on the desperate battle. The Hive Fleet was shattered. Even bereft of direction, the individual ship beasts were still deadly, and the humans were outnumbered 20 times to 1. She watched as one of their light cruisers was snagged by a trio of Kraken ships. It broke apart, its reactor dying with a bright plasma fire. She came to a decision. "Lord Admiral," she spoke aloud. There was a long pause before Kellamar answered. "My lady," his voice was weak. "What is the status of your ship? Your fleet?" "They are undamaged. My crew are distressed, some are dead." "Rouse them." "What was that?" "The Great Dragon," she said. She kept her voice cold. Frightened her fear would creep into her voice. If it did, she was sure she would lose her mind. "Bring your ships back into battle order." "We do not return to Eandon?" "We do not return to Eandon. We remain here to help the Monkai." "That was not the plan." "Plans change," she said. "Every weapon will be needed in the coming fight." Slowly, the Eldar fleet regained its prior order and drove back to the Tyranids. "Tell the humans, we are coming," she said. Ythelem nodded. His face bore lines to it had not before. Iana slipped back into her couch and reconnected with the dead pilots of the Wraith bombers, informing them of their new task. They welcomed it gladly, for the vengeance of the dead knows no bounds. Now, I'm really wondering how that conversation would go. "Hey, sorry we just blew up your planet and ditched you and then basically passed out, but we're back again, so hope you're still okay." Still though, I guess it is better than nothing, and the crew would at the very least be grateful for their lives. And again, you can see the logic in this sort of thing. And honestly, I don't think the Eldari would have stayed behind to help save some humans if they were just fighting on foot, like if it was a bunch of guardsmen or even a bunch of space marines. However, they will show out to protect Imperium Navy vessels if it means they can stay in the fight later on. It's not the warmest relationship you could possibly imagine, but there is a much greater consideration and a much greater ease of cooperation here than you would see with effectively any other branch of the Imperium. And that is why I say definitively, the one group in the entire galaxy that likes the Eldari the most is the Imperial Navy. But what do you guys think? Do you guys agree with me when I say the Imperial Navy likes the Eldar the most? Or do you think there's another group I missed that really likes them more? Or do you guys believe I'm overplaying this entire relationship altogether and that no Xenos can ever be trusted? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube member, as it does really help out the channel. And consider joining my Discord server to better keep up with me and all the things I'm working on. And until then, I will see you in the next video. Hopefully, without pneumonia.